Welcome to our lecture introducing natural selection and evolution. We've started to discuss a few concepts that overlap with evolution and natural selection. We've talked about alleles, we've talked about Mendelian genetics, and we've discussed meiosis and some of the repercussions of meiosis. But now let's look at natural selection and the theory of evolution and how that came about, and talk about a few examples. So this should be a pretty interesting lecture. A lot of these concepts are easier to understand than a lot of the things we've been discussing so far, so I hope you get a lot out of it. Let's discuss how populations and biological diversity evolves. The idea of evolution did not come about at one time from one person. There was a movement towards the understanding of evolution and natural selection that ended with a few persons describing it in a pretty thorough way. But at first, there were some patterns in nature that were described by people like Aristotle. Aristotle began to divide things into different groups. He noticed there was some order to the way the natural world worked. That order may or may not make a lot of sense now, but at the time, he did his best, and we had things like substance, which split body and spirit. Within body, we had things like living things and non-living things, like rocks. Living things included animals and plants. Of course, we're forgetting fungi. And animal was split to man and beast, which we now know animal is animal. But Aristotle was really describing this pattern that organisms are in relatively stable categories. These things tend to stay the same over time. Elephants are elephants, and if you go back to where elephants are found, you'll find elephants. So that made it so that he could categorize things, categorize the natural world in a way that others could later reference. In 1749, another naturalist by the name of Buffon began to describe that organisms tend to change over distances. So this kind of set the stage for a different kind of pattern recognition, a different kind of pattern that we see in our landscapes. Buffon recognized that if you go to one area, you'll find a species, and if you move across the landscape, you'll still find that species, but it'll have little changes. It'll accumulate changes. In this example, you can see that in the northern areas of Eurasia, you find the mammoth, which looks a lot like an elephant, but of course it's different. It has fur, has much larger tusks. And as you go south, you start to see different morphologies of an elephant, which is still clearly an elephant, but you're getting these changes that happen over a distance. So this starts to set up the observation that species have some differences, but also strong similarities within groups. Buffon also published this Histoire naturelle. This is a book that described all of these different forms in nature, and it's a really beautiful book. You might have seen copies of this as gift wrap or maybe as art on walls, but this is really a great documentation of species found and the species diversity that Buffon encountered during his travels and his observations. Lamarck was one of the first biologists and naturalists to really take a stab at describing a mechanism of change, a mechanism of evolution. We call this Lamarckian evolution, and while this didn't end up being correct, it is a good guess. So Lamarckian evolution postulates that if an animal requires some new morphology, let's say this giraffe, it needs a longer neck, it stretches its neck over its lifetime, it creates a need somehow, and when that organism has offspring, its offspring will somehow receive that information from the need that the parent had and will then grow that new morphology to address the need. So in this case, the giraffes needed a longer neck. They stretched their necks out their whole lives, and so their offspring were born with longer necks to account for the fact that the parents needed a longer neck. In 1830, a naturalist by the name of Lyell began to describe that there are many changes in nature that are gradual. He began to notice through the processes of geology that there's a lot of different subtle changes that happen over time spans that we don't observe directly during our lifetimes. So an example of that is that we have the deposition of sediment, maybe near a river mouth or near a body of water. We can see that there's a cyclic deposition of sediment. You can dig down in the mud and see years and years and years of layers. And just by inference, nearby we can find layers of clay and sediment and different soil types that indicate that this process has been going on for a very, very, very long time. In understanding that these sedimentation layers are a product of cyclic seasonal fluctuations in sediment, you can then start to guess as to how old organisms are because they're lower down in the sediment. So if you find an organism at the bottom of this pile of sediment, you know that that organism is probably a lot older than the organisms found towards the top. And this synced up with this pattern of finding bones and finding fossils in these really, really deep layers of sediment. So that would suggest that there was some kind of change in organisms. Different kinds of organisms were found in the past and they don't seem to be around anymore. Using that understanding of deposition and sediment, when you go to landscapes like the Grand Canyon here, you're forced to comprehend that the Earth has been around for a very, very, very long time. This time scale really puts into perspective that organisms that we see today might be very, very different than organisms in the past. The organisms that you would find as a fossil at the bottom of this canyon are likely very different than the organisms that you would find fossilized towards the top of this canyon. All of these naturalists contributed to observations that were used by Darwin and Wallace to kind of form the modern idea of natural selection.